Woman returns from death with a horrifying message from Jesus. She never expected to die that day. One minute she was laughing with her family, feeling completely normal. The next, an unbearable pressure gripped her chest. It was as if invisible hands had reached inside, squeezing her heart with an unrelenting force. Her breath hitched, the room blurred. A sharp pain shot down her arm, and in that instant she knew something was terribly wrong. She tried to speak, to call for help, but no words came out. The world around her started to fade, like ink bleeding into water. Voices grew distant, faces stretched into shadows. Then nothing. A silence deeper than anything she had ever known swallowed her whole. There was no light, no sound, no sensation of falling or floating. Just an empty void, stretching endlessly in all directions. Then a noise. Faint at first. A muffled beeping. A voice shouting. A hand pressing against her chest. She could see them. She wasn't inside her body anymore. She was above it, looking down. The hospital room was chaos. A nurse barked orders. A doctor's face was tight with concentration as he pumped her chest. Her family stood at the edge of the room, frozen in horror. Her mother had collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Her husband clutched their daughter, whispering words she couldn't hear. She wanted to reach out, to tell them she was okay. But the moment she tried, she realized something was pulling her. It started as a whisper, a force tugging at the edges of her soul. Then it grew stronger, a magnetic pull, irresistible and all-consuming. She was being taken, lifted, pulled away from the hospital, from the earth, from everything she had ever known. The walls of the hospital dissolved into mist. The beeping machines, the frantic voices, the smell of antiseptic, all of it vanished. She was moving, faster than anything imaginable. A tunnel of light stretched endlessly ahead, yet it wasn't just light. It was alive. It pulsed and shimmered, humming with a sound that wasn't a sound at all, but something felt deep within the soul. And then she arrived. The place before her was unlike anything she had ever seen. There was no sun, yet everything glowed with a soft, golden light. The air shimmered, thick with something that wasn't quite air, but felt richer, purer. The ground beneath her feet wasn't earth, but it was solid, warm, alive. A presence surrounded her, powerful, immense, overwhelming. Yet at the same time, it was familiar, comforting, like being wrapped in the deepest love she had ever known. She turned, and that's when she saw him. A figure stood before her, cloaked in brilliant, blinding light. She couldn't see his face. It was too radiant, too holy. But she didn't need to. She knew. Every fiber of her being recognized him instantly. Jesus. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't know why. It was as if her soul was remembering something her mind had long forgotten. A longing she had carried her entire life without even realizing it. She fell to her knees. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't just sound, it was power itself. It resonated deep inside her, shaking the very core of her existence. You must return. The words hit her like a hammer. Return. Number. She wanted to stay. How could she go back after feeling this? But Jesus' face grew somber. The world is not ready. They do not see what is coming. A shiver ran through her. His voice carried something unexpected. Not just sadness, not just urgency. It carried sorrow. She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but before she could, the world around her changed. The glowing warmth disappeared. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, swallowing the golden light. And then, she saw it. A vision. a glimpse of the future. And it was worse than anything she could have ever imagined. Her chest tightened as the golden light around her faded into shadows. The warmth of his presence still lingered, but something else was creeping in. A weight, a force pressing against her soul. It was as if the air itself had thickened, vibrating with something unseen, something ominous. She looked at Jesus, searching his face for answers. His expression remained sorrowful, yet firm, as though he carried the weight of an entire world on his shoulders. Then, without warning, the darkness around them cracked open like glass. The world shifted. She was no longer standing in the peaceful glow of his presence. She was somewhere else entirely. The ground beneath her feet trembled. A howling wind ripped through the air, carrying distant screams, desperate, agonized cries that sent chills down her spine. Thick, suffocating smoke rose from the horizon, twisting like ghostly fingers reaching toward the sky. She turned to Jesus in horror, but he didn't speak. He simply lifted a hand, and as he did, the vision sharpened. The earth was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, reduced to shattered concrete and twisted steel. Buildings that once stood tall were now mere skeletons, their windows blackened, their walls caved in. Fires raged uncontrollably, licking the sky with tongues of orange and red. Smoke blotted out the sun, casting everything in an eerie, blood-tinted glow. She could barely comprehend what she was seeing. Was this war? Famine? Some kind of natural disaster? Then she saw the people. Thousands, millions, wandering through the wreckage. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, their eyes vacant, like empty windows into soulless bodies. Some clutched at their chests as if struggling to breathe, while others stumbled blindly, whispering words that made no sense. They weren't just suffering. They were lost. She turned back to Jesus, desperation rising in her throat. "What is this? Why are you showing me this?" His eyes darkened. "This is what they do not see." Her heart pounded. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jesus extended his hand again, and that's when she saw him. A figure stood at the center of the chaos, high above the masses. His silhouette loomed over the broken world, standing on the steps of a grand structure, something resembling a palace, a temple, a place of power. His arms were raised, and the people below gazed at him as though he were their savior. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. Donald Trump. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Was he the cause of this? The solution? Why was he here, standing above the suffering world? She turned to Jesus, waiting for an answer, but his expression remained unreadable. "He has a role," Jesus said finally, "but they do not see what it truly is." A shiver ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" she pressed. "Is he—" But Jesus didn't let her finish. The vision shifted again, and suddenly, she was standing somewhere else. The ruins were gone. The suffering had vanished. Instead, she was inside a grand hall filled with cheering crowds. Confetti rained down from above. Music blared, cameras flashed, and there he was again. Trump stood at the center, smiling, waving. His face was on every screen. The people around him clapped and chanted, their voices rising in perfect unison, echoing off the towering walls. Something was wrong. It wasn't the celebration itself. It was the way the people looked at him. Their expressions weren't just joyful. They were reverent, worshipful. Their eyes were filled with something more than admiration. They were filled with devotion. A feeling of unease twisted in her gut. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something. Someone. A figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the crowd. It wasn't Trump. It wasn't a politician. It wasn't a person at all. It was something else. A shape, a presence, a darkness. It lurked behind the celebration, unseen by the people, yet fully aware of them. Its form was shifting, ever-changing, as if it was both there and not there at the same time. And then, it turned to look at her. Cold terror shot through her. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel it watching her, studying her. And it was smiling. Her pulse hammered. "Who is that?" she asked, but her voice barely made a sound. Jesus' expression grew even heavier. "The war is not of flesh and blood." Her breath hitched. "They have already been deceived." The world around her started to blur. The grand hall, the cheering crowds, the shadow in the distance. It all faded into mist. She turned to Jesus in panic. "Wait, tell me more. I don't understand." But his hand was already reaching toward her. And then, with a force stronger than anything she had ever felt before, she was pulled back, rushing, spiraling, falling. And then, her eyes snapped open. She was back in the hospital, back in her body. But nothing would ever be the same again. The moment she returned to her body, she felt it. A weight, something invisible yet suffocating, clung to her, pressing against her chest. Her lungs burned as they filled with air, her heart pounding in her ears. The hospital room around her was a blur of white coats and frantic voices, but none of it mattered. Because she had seen it. She had seen him, and she had seen it. Her fingers trembled as she tried to move. The beeping of the machines around her seemed distant, almost unreal. A doctor leaned over her, shining a light into her eyes, speaking words she couldn't focus on. Nurses scurried around, adjusting tubes, checking monitors. She barely noticed them. The vision still burned inside her skull. The darkness, the ruin, the figure in the shadows. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs were weak, her body unresponsive. A sharp pain shot through her chest, a reminder that she had died, that she had been gone for nearly 15 minutes. 15 minutes in the hospital, but an eternity there. She turned her head, scanning the room, searching for something, anything, that would ground her. Her gaze landed on her mother, sitting in the corner, her hands clasped together in desperate prayer. Her husband was beside her, his eyes red, his face drained of color. Their daughter clung to his side, her tiny fingers wrapped around his sleeve, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. She wanted to comfort them, to tell them she was okay, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep inside she knew she wasn't okay. Something had followed her back. The feeling of its presence hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. A shadow lingering just beyond her vision, always there, watching, waiting. She wasn't alone, and she wasn't safe. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. She clenched her fists, willing herself to focus. What had Jesus meant? What had he been trying to show her? She had seen Trump standing above the people, had seen the way they looked at him, their faces filled with devotion, their voices rising in unison. But she had also seen something else, something darker. That thing lurking in the background, hidden behind the celebration. It hadn't been watching the people, it had been watching him. And now, it was watching her. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The machines beeped wildly as her pulse spiked. A nurse rushed to adjust the IV, but she barely felt it. Her mind was spinning. She had to go back. She had to ask Jesus what it all meant. Was Trump the danger? Was he the answer? Was he being used? Controlled? Was he the one people needed to fear? Or was it something else entirely? But the vision was gone. And Jesus had sent her back. Why? Why send her back without all the answers? A chill ran through her, because that was the test. He hadn't sent her back to understand. He had sent her back to warn. Her pulse quickened as the weight on her chest deepened. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. She turned her head slowly, scanning the room again. And then, she saw it. A shadow. Not cast by the hospital lights, not something natural. It was there, just outside the doorway. Still. Silent. Watching. Her heart slammed against her ribs. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. It had followed her. The world around her seemed to dim. The voices of the nurses, the sound of the machines, they all faded into the background. All she could hear was a single, quiet whisper. A voice that didn't belong in this world. "You should have stayed." Her blood turned to ice. No one else reacted. No one else heard it. But she had. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to shut her eyes, to focus. The war is not of flesh and blood. Jesus' words echoed in her mind, cutting through the fear. They have already been deceived. She inhaled sharply, her fingers digging into the bedsheets. This wasn't just about Trump. This wasn't just about politics. This was bigger, much bigger, and no one saw it coming. The room was spinning. Her body felt heavy, as if she were still caught between two worlds, one foot in the hospital, the other still lingering in that place beyond death. The nurses worked quickly, checking monitors, adjusting machines, speaking in hushed voices. But none of them knew. None of them saw. She wasn't the same. She could feel it. Something had changed inside her. The air around her felt different, like it was charged with electricity, like she was walking through a storm that no one else could see. Every movement, every sound felt distant, like she was watching the world through a thin sheet of glass. Then, a voice. "You're awake." She turned her head, her muscles aching from the effort. Her husband was there, gripping her hand so tightly it almost hurt. His eyes were glassy, his face pale, as if he had aged in the hours she had been gone. "You were..." He swallowed hard. "They said you were dead." The words felt strange. Dead. She had been dead. She had been gone. And yet, here she was. Her mother, still clutching a rosary in her trembling fingers, let out a strangled sob. "We thought we lost you." Her daughter peeked out from behind her father's arm, her wide eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, curiosity, something deeper. She wanted to say something, to tell them she was okay. But she wasn't. She would never be okay again. She licked her dry lips, her throat raw, as she forced herself to speak. "I saw him." The words sent a shock through the room. Her mother gasped, her grip tightening around the rosary. Her husband froze, his expression unreadable. The nurses paused, exchanging nervous glances, before one of them quickly excused herself. You saw?" Her mother's voice wavered. She nodded slowly, closing her eyes for a brief moment. The vision was still there, burned into her mind like a scar that would never fade. The ruins, the fire, the people wandering blindly. Trump standing above them, the way they worshipped him. And the thing in the shadows. She shivered, the memory sending a deep, primal terror through her bones. "What did he say?" her husband whispered. She hesitated. How could she explain it? How could she put into words the urgency, the weight of what she had seen? She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, something shifted in the air. A cold presence. It was here, watching. Her body tensed. The lights in the hospital flickered for the briefest moment, so quick that no one else seemed to notice. But she did. It hadn't left. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay steady. "I have to warn people," she said finally. "I was sent back for a reason." Her mother nodded eagerly, eyes shining with faith. Yes, of course. You have to share what he told you. But her husband frowned. Warn them about what? She hesitated. How could she explain it without sounding crazy? How could she tell them that Jesus himself had sent her back with a message that no one would want to hear? That the world had already chosen their king? That they had already been deceived? She swallowed hard. Something is coming, she whispered. Something big, and people don't see it. A heavy silence filled the room. Her husband studied her, his expression shifting between love, fear, and something else. Concern. You've been through something traumatic, he said carefully. Maybe you should rest first. We can talk about this when you... No, she cut him off, her voice stronger now. We don't have time. A sharp, beeping sound filled the air as one of the monitors spiked. The nurse rushed back in, adjusting the wires, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were locked onto the doorway. It was there again. That presence, the shadow. It hadn't left. It was waiting. For her. She turned back to her husband, gripping his hand with sudden desperation. You have to believe me. His face softened, but there was hesitation in his eyes. I do believe you. I just... Before he could finish, the hospital intercom crackled overhead, the static hissing unnaturally loud. For a split second, a whisper echoed through the room. A voice, distorted, inhuman. It's already begun. And then, silence. The static disappeared. The intercom returned to normal. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining it. It knew she was trying to warn them. It didn't want her to. She sucked in a sharp breath, her hands shaking. Jesus had told her. The war wasn't of flesh and blood. The battle wasn't just political. It wasn't just about Trump. It was something far worse, and the world was walking into it blindly. She turned back to her family, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her chest. They need to know, she said. Everyone needs to know. Her mother nodded. Her husband hesitated. Her daughter just watched. And in the shadows, unseen by anyone else, it waited, smiling.